Hey everyone, and welcome to the final part of painting Sigvald. This is definitely going to be the easiest thing to do and the shortest video, as we're just doing the base. I think the sculpted base is actually really nice, and Games Workshop are definitely improving upon that. It's quite nice sometimes because when you get a display model like Sigvald, sometimes you have to come up with a base, and for me that actually takes a lot of time thinking of a concept. It's more building, so the fact it comes with a fantastic base and you can just get on with the painting, for me, is a real plus. I think that the cool thing about this base is you have lots of interesting shapes, particularly the pillar, as it's just that column that sticks straight out, and you can use the base as an opportunity to help sell your light source effect. And that's what I focused on my base, is just getting that light source consistent, lots of shadow on one side, lots of light on the other. I tried to keep all the colors dull. You want the base to support the figure and frame it, but not take away from it. So often I see people say they're painting a blue miniature and they think they need an orange base for it to stand out. But then the orange base actually is brighter than the model, and I think it can detract. So always think of the base as an important thing, particularly with a display figure, but it should support the model and not take away. For example, Sigvald is non-metallic gold, which essentially is brown and yellow. And that's actually what I've done with the base, is it's kind of a sandy desert feel, which is brown and yellow too. But because it's desaturated, it's much darker. The contrast is obviously a lot less with us pushing so bright on the non-metallic gold. So for me, it kind of works. And we have such a strong contrast with the purple and the gold that we don't really want another really strong one. We've got the little gems in blue too. So for me, I wouldn't want to introduce another color. A little bit like with the non-metallic gold, I pre-highlighted this black and white, and it wasn't really necessary. I'm base coating with Rhinox hide here, and for me actually the white makes Rhinox hide too reddish. If we spray it over black, then it is more desaturated, and it kind of picks out the reddiness of the brown if we have the white underneath. It wasn't a problem for me. I can just do more layers of Rhinox hide to kind of cover it up. But in retrospect, yeah, I'd probably just blast Rhinox hide over black. It doesn't really matter for the final effect because where those pre-highlights are, we're going to be going over with highlight colors anyway. But build up a nice smooth coat of Rhinox hide. So there you can see how it looks with the Rhinox hide. And I'm going to move to the first highlight, which is my ever faithful Gobi Brown. And we're just spraying this from one direction now, rather than over the whole thing. And I've got it quite diluted, so the coverage isn't great here. So it's going to take me a couple coats to build that up. So here you can see the Gobi Brown after I've built it up with a couple coats. And I've covered a lot of the base, leaving the Rhinox hide in some of the darker shadows. And now I'm just going to build that up and get it a little more opaque. So this is still just Gobi Brown, but the first layer just didn't have the coverage, and I'm just building it up slowly and smoothly. You can pick out all the skulls, all the little rocks. We can all start with this same color at this point. And you can see that texture on the top is actually getting picked out really nicely because we're airbrushing it from that one direction. So I think that looks great already with just Rhinox hide and Gobi Brown, and you can see how effective it is airbrushing these things from one direction. Loads of that detail's been picked out, and it already feels like it has some nice shadows. I'm adding Deck Tan to Gobi Brown now to further enhance the highlights, and I've chosen Deck Tan to keep it desaturated on the rock. I don't want it to go too yellow, so it's fighting with the non-metallic gold actually. And I'm kind of being less general now and more specific, and just trying to be tighter with the airbrush, just picking out certain areas. So you can see on that main part of the skull, I'm just trying to catch some of the top and that kind of main flat area above the eye on the brow. and just move around gradually, always going from the same direction. So it's ended up being pretty light, and this normally happens when you're airbrushing. The last colour you did tends to cover the biggest area, even if you've got a lot of control. So what I'm going to do now is go back to the rhinox hide, and you can see I'm holding it at a pretty extreme angle, and the airbrush is almost just aiming upwards, the exact opposite to how we were spraying the highlights. And as you've seen in my videos before, I normally go back to the shadows as kind of a final glaze, and this just reinforces and kind of gets them back in the right volume. And it works really great on that sculpted texture because it just picks out all those little lumps and bumps. I added a tiny bit of black to the rhinox hide just to take away a little bit of that reddishness and make it more desaturated for the extreme shadows. And you can see I'm holding at that really tight angle and just trying to catch all the really, really dark areas. And this just works really great. What's nice as well is the airbrush provides a soft light, and that's what we want for the base, I think. If it's too defined, then the base will distract from the figure itself. And we'll talk about that later when I pick the details out. When I use diluted paints, like this shadow, it tends to come out pretty glossy in the airbrush. I believe that's because of the amount of thinner I'm using, and so it's always worth giving it a matte varnish. You could just do it at the end, but I just gave it a quick matte varnish so I could kind of see where I'm going for the next steps. So now I move to the brush, and I'm going to use that same mix of the Gobi Brown and Deck Tan. And it's important we pick out some details and define different areas. But like I said, we don't want too much. If you overly define the base, it will distract from the figure itself. So I pick out some areas with the brush. As you can see, this is kind of where I'm at with it. And I've picked out some of the details, but haven't gone kind of crazy, just kept it to some of the edges, not every single one. And now I'm going to use pure Deck Tan on its own to just pick out a couple tiny bits more. And I'm not sure that this is entirely necessary, but it's nice to have, a couple areas where it's really light and just, follow the light source. So as you're doing this, just work out where you really need more light and try not to overdo it. It can also be really time consuming as well if you kind of highlight every edge on every element of the base. Now we're going to start working on the sand, and we're going to just take some Zandri dust from Citadel, and we're going to dilute this with a lot of water and just run it in all the sandy areas. And we're going to also run it into the details, which will tie them together quite nicely. This is a really forgiving effect, and if you're not sure how it's going to be, start off with too much water, try it on a little bit and see what it looks like when it's dry. But like I said, it's super forgiving and it just works really well. You can do the same thing with weathering powder actually, where you just mix it with water to make a wash, but that does tend to dry very, very pale. And using this paint, I knew it wouldn't be so strong in colour. So I give it a second pass and up the intensity. I actually dilute it a little bit less. And then it's going to be more opaque, a stronger colour, and then I concentrate that in some of the recesses and just make it a bit more varied. It's quite nice actually, you're just kind of creating a little bit of transition and variance with the sand. You can tell it's a little bit thicker because it's flowing not as well, so I'm a bit more purposeful and just painting it in on the exact areas I want it to be. It's nice to have it clawing around the rocks and things as it kind of defines those rocks, but not in an edge highlighty kind of way. And you can see what it looks like when it's dried, and I think it looks really natural, really great, not too distracting, and it's so easy. And you can see where I've done the two different layers and how it's dried in all the cracks where it's concentrated. And it's a really nice effect, I think. Easy, subtle. You can use this sort of thing on gaming bases too, I think, which is great. So we need to pick out the skulls in a different colour slightly. I'm going to use olive brown mixed with some deck tan. You could use gobi brown mixed with some deck tan. I like to use deck tan instead of like your shabti bone or a yellowish colour because again it's more desaturated. So you're going to pick out and kind of base coat the entire skull with this first layer. Once you've got a nice base coat, nice and smooth, you can just add in some more deck tan and just keep moving up in increments. Depending on your taste and how light you want these bones to be, you could use pure deck tan for the final highlight. It all depends on, how much contrast you like on the skulls and how pale you want them to be. I often feel that people paint bones and skulls in the same way, and they're a little yellowish, a little too reddish in the shadows with brown washes, and sometimes it's maybe a bit too pale. I like them to be quite dull, as they shouldn't draw the eye too much. But like I said, deck tan's such a boring, desaturated colour that if you build up to that as the final highlight, you can't go wrong really. You can see I build up those final highlights, and I like to do texture on the skulls too, like they've been sat there a while, so you can just do little scratches, little marks, almost like stippling, just to build up that highlight. And again, this has got to follow the same light source as the figure itself, and it will just look really great. I painted the other elements with the same recipes we've already used, like the little gold Slanesh symbol and the blue symbol, and I just did quite a quick job on these, and you could paint this the same time as you do your other gold, or maybe do it a different colour like silver so it doesn't stand out. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial compared to all the other ones. It feels way simpler, but I hope it's given you some nice ideas on how you can do these big scenic bases, particularly the use of the airbrush. What I love about the airbrush is it kind of behaves just like light, and it will cover everything from that angle you're spraying it at. And like I said briefly earlier in the tutorial, I think it's important that the basing elements have soft light. When we paint things like armor, we want lots of definition, and we edge highlight, and we paint all these high contrasting highlights, especially with non-metallic elements. But the base, it should be really general, and like I said, just support the model in terms of color and selling your light source effect. Often big areas of rock have horizontal surfaces, vertical surfaces, and these are really key to selling that light source effect. So starting off with the airbrush gives you a really nice general light, and then you can just pick away with the brush, picking out the things you need, but not going too far. I've kind of over detailed things before, and it's been to the detriment of the overall appearance. And I hope you liked just doing the simple washes with the pale colours, so actually your recesses have that kind of lighter effect and it looks like dust. So yeah, I guess from my perspective, after doing these difficult tutorials with gold, silver, skin and cloth, that it felt quite strange to do this tutorial, which seemed relatively simple, but I think there's some important points there and some things you could use on any miniature. And this is achievable on gaming miniatures too. If you watch my White Scar bike tutorial, that's got a similar thing where I use the airbrush to catch all the shadows and details of the bases. So I hope that you have enjoyed this whole series of Sigvald. Like I said, early days, I had quite the strict deadline, but I'm really happy with the final result. I didn't cut corners, so to speak, but I did find ways of painting it fast, relatively fast, and effective, I think. And the base was one of those things. It took me 3 hours to paint the base in total, as you can probably tell, with the fast airbrushing and then just a few details to pick out. And that allowed me to stick to my deadline and get the model done. It's not going to be the last time I cover these subjects. I have a couple projects to do. One of them is actually Sanguinius, the Primarch model, and that's going to have some non-metallic gold again. So if you prefer to see me actually painting, because I know I talked over stills, that will be coming. And I'll always take a different approach in terms of how I deliver the tutorial and as well as how I do the gold. So I'll try and do a different recipe, different colors, and just always show you different ways of doing gold. It's a tricky one because you always want to have as much variety on the channel as possible, but sometimes I have to paint some miniatures where there is a crossover, but I'll try and make sure there's some variation in some way. So any thoughts, please comment below about this tutorial in particular or about the entire project as a whole, and I'm looking forward to starting a new miniature and sharing the tutorials with you guys. So until then, have fun painting Sigvald.